I was born in Ireland. My parents were refugees from Germany. They escaped from Hitler's Germany because they were Jews. And so I was born in Ireland. So I have some feeling for people who have had a similar background, because of the Tibetan story. My story, in some ways, is similar. But I had a lot of advantages because I had access to very good education, and I had the privilege of going to Oxford University, where I studied French and German. So nothing to do with what I later did. And so, all kinds of things can happen in one's life. One's life can take a completely different direction. So anyway, I taught in England for a while, taught all kinds of things, including art, which has always been a deep interest of mine. And then I came here, and at one point I thought I would like to be a Thangka painter because of my deep interest in art and my love for painting. But then I ended up becoming a translator. So it was the same story when I went to Oxford. First I thought I wanted to go to art school, and then I ended up in Oxford doing something more intellectual. And so same thing happened when I came here, and I ended up becoming a translator. So I began to translate for Genla in 1983, and then in 1989 I was asked to translate at the library. I always wanted to translate at the library, but they didn't want a woman, and they didn't want somebody who wasn't ordained, a monk. So, but then suddenly there were no translators, and that was my moment. So now, when I first sat in a class with other people translating, because I came here from 1971 to 73, and that was when the library opened in 1971, and I was able to study here from quite near the beginning, and I thought, oh, how wonderful it would be to be a translator and act as the bridge. And so then I got the chance to be the bridge. And when you are the bridge, you have to be a reliable bridge, right? So when you're, the main job of a translator is to act as that bridge, and you want to be reliable. So in other words, when you're translating, you have to be accurate. You have to be accurate and win the trust of the person for whom you are translating, and the trust of those for whom you are translating, to whom you are translating. So that's really important, and that applies to oral translation. If you're doing written translation, you have to make the reader confident that what you are giving them is really accurate. But it also needs to be elegant. A bridge shouldn't be, just only standing there and reliable. It needs to be a beautiful structure. So how you translate is very important. So you need to combine accuracy with elegance. And whatever language you're translating into, so I'm going to use English because that was the language that I translated into, but it applies to every language. What you say or what you write should sound like or read like normal English, right? So it has to be accurate, it has to be elegant, it has to sound normal and not like some strange language that you've invented. So knowledge of the languages is very important. You need to have a love for language. If you're going to be dealing with language, with words. But even more important is your love of meaning, right? Because that's your main job, to convey meaning. So you need to love language, love words, but even more than that, you need to love meaning and helping other people to understand meaning. So you need an adequate knowledge of the language from which you are translating. So if you're translating into Tibetan, you need an adequate knowledge of English. For me, I was translating from Tibetan into English, so I needed an adequate knowledge of Tibetan. My knowledge of Tibetan is not so good, actually. Because when I began, which was a long time ago, there were very few books to help me learn Tibetan, and most people who were teaching didn't really know how to teach Tibetan as a foreign language to someone who wasn't brought up speaking Tibetan. And I was a little bit lazy about grammar, right, as well, because my main interest was Buddhist philosophy, the Buddha Dharma. So now there are lots of young people learning Tibetan who are doing it much better than me, and who are learning the grammar properly. I don't think it's so important for us foreigners to learn to write good Tibetan. I mean, of course, we have to be able to write a little bit, but that's not the main thing. But we should be able to read really well, to understand the grammar well enough to read. And then we have to be able to understand spoken Tibetan. And of course, Tibetan presents a lot of problems because people from different areas sound very different. So my Genla came from Kham, Venerable Geshe Sonam Rinchen. So I was with him for 35 years. I studied with him for 35 years. And he spoke with a Kampa accent from his particular area, which was Chehor. So people were often surprised that I could understand him, because Tibetan people from central Tibet often couldn't understand him so well. But then I could understand him. But then if you gave me somebody from a different area of Kham, I probably wouldn't have understood very well. And if you gave me somebody from Amdo, even more difficult. So I know that there was a certain difficulty for me always in understanding Genla, because when I heard people from central Tibet speak, and when I was asked a few times to translate for other people, and somebody who spoke central Tibetan, it was always like a feeling of relief, because I wasn't sort of straining to understand. I could understand more easily. So, so we need an adequate knowledge, anyway, of the language from which we're translating. That's very important. And the language into which we're translating, we should be fluent. We should be as fluent as possible. So if you're translating into English, that's difficult because it's not your native language. So you have to gain fluency. If you were educated at an English medium school, that of course makes it much easier, but then you may have some difficulty with Tibetan. So anyway, fluency is very, very important, and a rich vocabulary. But when we're translating, we want to use as few words as possible to convey the meaning. You don't want to drown the people who are listening to you in a tangle of words. Right? So clarity is very, very important. And if you can convey your message clearly with few words, that is the very best thing. So then you also need a good knowledge of technical terminology. So whatever it is that you're translating, say it's not the Buddha Dharma, but it may be medicine, right? Say you're translating a talk on Tibetan medicine. So you need to understand the technical terminology that is used in Tibetan medicine. You need to have a good understanding of that, and then you need to have some knowledge of medical terminology in English as well to convey those ideas. If you're talking about, I don't know, engineering, right? If you're translating something on engineering, you need knowledge of that. If you're talking about ecology, the environment, then you need knowledge of environmental terminology, and you need to be able to do that in both languages. So knowing the technical terminology is very, very important. Now, when you're translating Buddha Dharma, you know, the Buddhist teachings into English, I don't personally feel it is a very good idea to translate the terminology that is used in Tibetan into Sanskrit and then use a whole lot of Sanskrit words in your English. Because your audience isn't going to be able to understand Sanskrit any better than they understand Tibetan, unless they happen to be Indians who have a good knowledge of Sanskrit or whose Hindi maybe helps them to understand Sanskrit. But translating, translating Tibetan terms into Sanskrit, I don't feel is very helpful. Of course, a few words have gone into the English language, like Buddha and bodhicitta sometimes, but even that I don't like to use that word. Bodhisattva has gone into the English language, and words like karma, but they're often really misunderstood. Okay? So that's what I want to say about that. And then, knowledge of the subject. So not just the technical terminology, but you need a really in-depth knowledge of the subject matter that you're working on. You can't really hope to make a good translation, either written translation or oral translation, unless you really, really understand the subject matter that you're translating. So, you can't translate things that you haven't understood intellectually. How can you, I'm not talking about realizations when it comes to the Buddha Dharma. Of course, great if you have realizations as well. But if you haven't understood a concept intellectually, how can you help somebody else to understand the meaning? You can't. So it's really important to understand what you're translating. So, for instance, if you're translating, Buddhism, you need to have an understanding, for instance, of what constitutes a precious human rebirth. All the different things about impermanence, about the connection between actions and their effects, the 12 links of dependent existence or dependent arising, Tender Lien Lak Chuni, things like that. You need to be able to remember those things like that, those 12 links. You should know them just like that, so that you don't get confused when somebody is explaining about them. You should have that in your head. Then you need to know about, Jangchup Sem, and the different ways of developing bodhicitta, the spirit of enlightenment. So you should have that at your fingertips, so that you don't get surprised. Then you should understand, at least intellectually, about emptiness and dependent arising. So that's really important. To understand about those things as well, because they're quite complex and quite intellectual, demanding. And so if you don't understand, how are you going to help other people to understand? So that's important too. Okay, so then there's, the difference between written and spoken translation. So spoken translation is really dynamic, right? It's something very much alive. You can easily, when you look at the people that you're translating for, you can usually get a good idea of whether they're understanding what you're saying. You could just look at their faces and you can see whether they're able to relate to what you're saying. And some of the people who are listening, they're not all going to be at the same level. So some of the people who are listening to you are going to understand more easily. Some people may not be conversant with the terminology. They may not know the terminology. And so, it's really important to define what you mean by certain terms. Like, for example, when we use something like Jangchup Sem, when we're translating that, we say the spirit of enlightenment, we may say the altruistic intention to become enlightened, we may call it the awakening mind or something like that. But you have to keep redefining what you mean by these terms, like the awakening mind. It doesn't mean so much to people who don't already know those terms. So you have to look at your audience and see, whether you think they understand, and then you would just redefine it and say, in the awakening mind, the aspiration to attain enlightenment for the sake of all living beings, right? So then you've defined it again. And you should do that from time to time to make sure that people understand the terminology that you're using. So then if, for example, if you're talking about karma, if you're talking about actions and their effects, right? So you have to keep defining what you mean. If you do end up using the word karma, you need to say actions and their effects, lende, because that's important. That's much closer to the Tibetan than it is like karma, the word. People have very strange ideas of what that word means in the West, right? They don't understand it accurately. They understand it as something like destiny, So you have to keep saying actions and their effects, and so like that. And then you need to be aware that not everybody in your audience is a native English speaker if you're translating. Like in our classes here at the library, there were people from all over the world. So, of course, there were a lot of people whose native language was English. There were Americans and people from the UK and Australians and New Zealanders and people from Europe who learn English in school because not so many people speak their language, like people from Holland or Sweden or Denmark. But then there are other people whose native language isn't English, and so you always have to bear in mind that there are people who don't maybe understand English so easily, and so you have to make it like sometimes a little simpler. You maybe say it in a more elegant way and then in a slightly simpler way, so that everybody can understand you. Okay. And straightforward English is best, right? So you don't need to impress your audience by using complicated words. Right? It's not like how complicated the English you use is, but how straightforward it is, so that people can really understand you. You don't need to, you need a rich vocabulary, but you shouldn't be trying to impress people by how many complicated words you know. So straightforward English is best. Now, you know, when you're doing oral translation for someone, it's really important to remember the order in which the person makes the points. Right? This is particularly important, like, it's important always, but, you know, for example, when you're translating for a scholar of philosophy in Buddhism, like a Geshe or, you know, any scholar, they have a way of presenting the material. They have a way of presenting their material which is logical. It's a logical progression. This is something which any good Geshe Larampa will do. They won't wander all over the place with the topic. The way they present it is very, very important. There's an order and it's a logical progression. And so you have to be able to keep that in mind, and present it in the same order. Now, I was able to train my Genla to feed me spoonfuls, right? So not too long, short segments. If you're translating, if the speaker speaks not too long, and then you speak, and then he speaks, and then you speak, or she speaks, and then you speak, so then it's very dynamic, and the audience forget the translator completely. They feel that it's all coming from the speaker, because it's moving so quickly between the speaker and the translator that it seems to be all coming from the speaker. And that's what you really want. You don't, I mean, it's all right to have some personality and to make people laugh sometimes, but you know, you want it mainly to feel, your audience to feel that it's coming from the speaker, because you're the bridge, right? You're the bridge between the listeners and the speaker. So, now sometimes you get speakers who go on for a really long time. Now that presents a problem, you know, because how are you going to remember that? If it's short, it's easy to remember. You can, if you can train yourself, and you can train yourself, because I was able to do so, so that means anybody can do it, then you can remember. But if it goes on for a really long time, and sometimes like His Holiness goes on for a really long time, then you're going to need to make some notes. Now, you're not going to have time to write down everything. So what you need to train yourself to do is just to take down keywords. Keywords, one word for each point. One word will be enough to trigger your memory. If you're listening carefully, you don't need to write a whole lot of words. You just need to write like a couple of words for each point. You know, one word sometimes is enough, and that will remind you of that point. You can train yourself to do this. So you don't need to sit down there like trying to get everything down. No. If you listen hard and then just take down one word or two words or three words, that's enough. That will trigger the point. And then you'll be able to preserve the order. So preserving the speaker's order is really important, not to jumble everything up. I'll be finished in a minute. Okay. So, all right. So then Tika was here, you know, talking to you about simultaneous translation, because that's what she did at the UN. So that's very, very stressful, doing simultaneous translation. I've actually never had to do that. I've always had a space in which to translate. But when you're doing simultaneous translation, you really need to be well prepared and to know your subject matter. And as she will have told you, in the UN where she translated, they take off the simultaneous translators after about half an hour or 40 minutes because it's so stressful, right? Now here, people who are doing simultaneous translation for His Holiness, they have to keep going for hours. It used to be like several hours in the morning and several hours in the afternoon. I mean, now His Holiness doesn't teach for so long anymore, but he used to teach many hours in one day, so it was very, very hard work for a simultaneous translator to have to keep going. You know, and that happened many times when His Holiness was mainly giving teaching for Tibetan people. Then, you know, the English person translating into English had to do simultaneous translation. What else did I want to say about that? Yeah. And then in simultaneous translation, there's a real problem between Tibetan and English, because in Tibetan, the verb comes at the end, right? In English, the verb comes near the beginning of the sentence. So the translator, who's doing simultaneous translation, can't wait for the verb. So he or she has to anticipate the verb, guess what the verb is going to be. So that's really hard. And so that's why it's really important to know your subject matter and maybe to have prepared what the speaker is going to speak about, to have prepared that ahead of time. Because if you have to guess what the verb is, that's quite dangerous. You know, guesswork is no good. In general, in doing oral translation, you should never be afraid to ask the speaker to clarify for you what he or she has said. Because you should never guess what the speaker has said. If you haven't understood, you must ask, right? Because otherwise you run the danger of misunderstanding and conveying a misunderstanding to other people. You want to be quite sure that you've understood correctly so that you can pass on what has actually been said. So in a way, it helps if you have a good relationship with the speaker. So that was something that I had the privilege of, you know, having been able to develop with my beloved teacher, you know, over many years. So sometimes I got scolded. He was quite well known for looking at me crossly, but there was no crossness in his heart. And, you know, so I never felt afraid to ask. And that was very helpful to me because I could make sure I had understood properly. And then, you know, when you're doing oral translation, you can't afford to let your attention wander for even one moment, right? If you let your attention wander for a moment, if you're looking around the class or, you know, like looking at your audience, you'll miss something, right? It's dynamic, it's happening. You know, it's the greatest practice of mindfulness. I'm not a very good meditator, but that's one thing for all those years when I was translating. I could fix my attention single-pointedly on what was being said. Because I realized, you know, if I didn't do that, I missed something. And then that was really difficult. So you have to be able to focus on what is being said. And And even those days, I'm a very poor sleeper. No, I don't sleep well at night. And so I sometimes got to my little seat in the classroom feeling exhausted, and I'd sit down, and but then as soon as Genla started to speak, he woke me up, right? And, it woke me up, and I would be able to focus on what he was saying, because it's a very exciting process. So that's really important, and to be awake and attentive, not half asleep when you're doing oral translation. If you're doing written translation, you can go off and have a sleep and come back to it. But you can't afford to do that during the time that you're doing oral translation. Neurologists say that people who have done oral translation over a long period of time, there are certain parts of their brain that look different, when they do MRIs. They can see that certain parts of the brain are developed. It's like developing muscle, So you've developed a certain part of your brain. It looks different, and it functions in a different way. So that's something that oral translators develop. You wouldn't develop that as a written translator. But it's like a muscle you develop. So even if it's difficult at the beginning, you can be sure that as you go along, it will get easier. The great Shantideva, Shivala, he says in his Junjuk, he says that everything becomes easier, with practice. So this is a well-known thing. I mean, if you're playing the piano or playing the guitar, at the beginning it's very difficult, and then, it gets easier and easier. Same thing with any language. Anything you do, any sport you do, at the beginning it's difficult, and then, it becomes the language which you speak. The sport becomes the language that you speak. You're able to jump higher and higher. So, it's like that. All right. So if you're a new translator, then it's really important to prepare for each session carefully. If you're lucky, the person who is going to be teaching will take the time to prepare with you, to allow you to, prepare the section of the text. But the thing is that if the teacher is a really good teacher, he or she is not just going to be reading from the text, right? So it's important to prepare the part of the text that is going to be taught, but then the teacher, if they're a really good teacher, they're not just going to be reading out text. They're going to be talking and explaining. When my Genla began teaching, so I, began with him in 1989, but I began translating for him privately in 1983. I began in 1989 at the library here, and then continued until 2012. But I began translating for him when people were coming to see him, wanted to ask questions in 1983, and then in 1986 we first traveled together for 5 months in Australia. And, at the beginning he was still reading a lot from the text. And I said to him, Genla, people really love it when you speak to them, when you're not when you're looking at your text, but when you're looking at them and speaking to them, because they feel that you're talking to them, right? And Genla, he was so marvelous. He really took that to heart. And from that time onwards, he used to anyway prepare extensively for each class. He was never lazy. Wherever he was teaching, whenever he was teaching, he used to prepare at least an hour, sometimes 2 hours for each class, right? So that was impressed me so much, because he knew, he was a Geshe Larampa, he had studied for so many years. He was towards the end of his life, he had been teaching for so many years, 35 years. Still, he always sat down with the commentaries and prepared for every single class. So it's like so moving, you know? And, you know, so he never shortchanged the people who were listening to him. They always got something that was rich and well prepared. And so, you know, he did that. So we have to be prepared to do that as well. We have to be prepared to get ready. And so, you know, if you're lucky, you'll have somebody who will do it with you. If that person doesn't have time or the willingness to do it, you have to do it on your own. Try to get ready and understand, at least intellectually, what you're going to be. Then there are going to be surprises, and the person is going to tell stories, maybe. Genla he didn't talk so much like stories, wasn't really his thing. My first teacher, Geshe Sonam Rinchen, who taught at the library, he was a great storyteller. Genla didn't tell so many stories, but I noticed when he did tell stories, especially stories of his childhood in Tibet, then, you know, we had Tibetan people coming to the classes as well, and they really loved that because he was talking about his childhood in Tibet, which was, you know, quite amazing, because until he was 13, he was just taking the animals up the mountains, you know, with lots of other boys, and they just had a really wild time, and their life was really happy. And then he ran away to go, his family was a Sakya family, but he ran away to a Gelugpa monastery, Targi monastery, in his part of Kham, because Targi, why did he run away to Targi? Because Targi had a reputation as being warrior-like. And they had, the monastery was full of guns and armed. They had fought, you know, with other monasteries and with the Chinese several times. So it wasn't until this Genla's first Lama, who was called Geshe Jampa Kedrup, when he came from Sera, he was from Kham, but had gone to Sera to study. When he came back to Targi Monastery, then he changed what was happening there and made them go back to studying. And at the beginning, lots of people tried to kill him. They would wait at night. He would go around the monastery. When he was, you know, he became Kempo, and he would go around the monastery, and people tried to drop stones on him. You know, so it was a pretty rough place. And but then slowly, because he was so kind, and he always used to go to take care of sick monks himself and wash them and do everything himself like that. So then gradually he won people over, and the monastery, everybody said, Lokok Meba Soso, you know, that he had made them, he had robbed them of their courage, right? So, but then they started to study well, and the whole thing changed. So he was my Genla's first teacher and left a very deep impression. And so, you know, Genla was lucky that he had such a good teacher to begin with, who really encouraged him. And yeah, so he ran away from home at 13. His father, two of his brothers had become monks already, Sakya monks. And then, you know, Genla wasn't supposed to become a monk. His father wanted to keep him at home, but he ran away. And he said he could see his home. His home was up on a hill because his father actually was Dzongpen for a while, so they had a really old house that had been there for generations, and he could see it up on the hill. And when he had run away to the monastery, he actually felt a little homesick after some time. But his mother persuaded the father to let him become a monk. And then his father said, all right. So then you have to be a good monk. So that's how that happened. So that was my story. So another thing, when you're doing oral translation, there's something you can't prepare for, and that is question and answer sessions, right? So, people are going to ask questions to say it's, the speaker. In my case, it was always Genla, right? So they're going to ask questions. And then, you're going to have to translate those questions to the speaker and then translate the speaker's answer. So you can't prepare for that. You need a lot of cultural sensitivity to understand what the questioner is asking, right? Where is this question coming from? Because it may be something with which, like as a Tibetan person, for example, that you're not familiar. So why is this person asking about these things? Because Western people often ask about relationships. My Genla was really surprised because Tibetan people ask about property and money and, and all things like that. But they very rarely ask about relationships. And when we traveled to Australia for, the first time we traveled together, most of the people that came to see Genla, they wanted to talk about meditation and things like that, yes, but they also wanted to ask questions about their relationship, their boyfriend or girlfriend or husband or wife, or, that was the main thing they wanted to talk about. And Genla was a monk from the age of 13. He gave the most wonderful advice, wonderful, really excellent advice. Basically what he said, be kind to each other, I didn't hear him say, you have to stay together, he didn't say that. He encouraged people to stay together if they could. But basically what he said is, be kind to each other. So it was wonderful advice. I was always astonished at how good his advice was and how people responded to that advice. So this is just an example. So when there are questions, you have to be culturally sensitive to where the questioner is coming from, where that question is coming from. So that means you have to know something about the other culture. And then the speaker, the speaker will even know, you're modern people, you're young, you're modern, you have been exposed to the world, right? Because now we have, we have all these different media, Facebook and Twitter and the internet in general. So you have much more exposure to the world. Genla came from a world which was completely different, right? He was in Tibet. He told me, he said they heard that you could sit in a room and it moved. That was a train compartment. He said they were amazed, when they heard about this, that you could sit in a room and it moved along. So he came from that world, right, that world, and then when he escaped from Tibet, then he was in Sera, where the discipline was very, very strict, very strict. They had to, in Cheho Kamsen, the young monks had to walk on tiptoe. They weren't allowed to put their feet down in case they made too much noise, right? So that's amazing. And then he escaped from Tibet, came to Boxodor in West Bengal, which was the most terrible place. It had been a British internment camp, where the British put their Indian prisoners. And so it had watchtowers and barbed wire, but it was a convenient place to put the monks because there were so many people, so they had to find somewhere to put them. Food was terrible. They couldn't speak the language. They weren't used to the food. Genla said, all the rice, all the dal was full of, bugs. It was like really terrible, and they never had enough food to fill their stomachs. So it was a really difficult time. Then he went from there to Sarnath, just when the Central Institute was being formed. He lived with 4 other monks in a corrugated iron building. Can you imagine in Varanasi in that heat to be in a corrugated box? They didn't have a window. They had to leave the door open. Genla said there was no worry about mosquitoes. The mosquitoes fried up in the heat. Right? So you could leave the door open. So that's where he went to. He said one day, you know, somebody had given him some tsampa and it was in a plastic bag. And then there were people who were cooking and they had some dalda, not ghee, right? Dalda, you know. And they wanted to have some dalda on their tsampa. And so he gave the plastic bag. And when the hot dalda went into the plastic bag, all the tsampa made a hole and it all came out the bottom. So think of that. Think of those like hardships that he experienced. So anyway, many other stories. But so he came from a completely different world. So the questioners question, you know, how to help Genla to understand what the questioner was asking. So I was lucky because I could understand it because it was my culture, you know, and I could speak Tibetan well enough and knew Genla well enough to try to explain to him. Then, you know, it was my job to translate his answer and not make something up that I wanted to say, right? But to translate what he said to the person. And you know, I've witnessed so often when somebody asks a question and the Lama or whoever gives the answer, it goes like this, you know, but you want it to go like this, you know, that the answer meets the questioner's need. So that's something so important, that the person feels that they've actually been heard and that they've been addressed. And Genla had this wonderful talent for taking, you know, you get all kinds of questions. You get people who ask questions so that you'll be impressed by how clever they are and intellectual they are, right? The smart Alex, you know, they want to, you know, impress with their question. Okay, so you have to translate that kind of question, and that's usually very easy for a Geshe to deal with, right? You know, the sort of intellectual question. But then there are lots of people who ask very sincere questions that come from their heart, not just about relationships sometimes. And sometimes you can't see exactly where that question has come from, but they've had some traumatic experience. And they're asking about that, but they don't say, I had this traumatic experience. Right, so there's, you know, it's like so important to that person that they are heard and that they receive an answer. And it could change their life. It could change their life. I mean, I witnessed many people coming back after 15, 20 years, you know, because I was there so many years, saying, you know, I was here for 3 months or something like that. You know, what you said really changed my life. So that's like a wonderful, rewarding thing. Because I worked for free here at the library. I never got paid, right? I did it as a voluntary thing for Genla, for the library. But that was like the best reward, isn't it? If somebody says, you know, it changed my life. So, you know, you get those kind of questions. Then you get questions which are quite stupid, you know, and maybe something which Genla has answered many times before, but this person has just dropped into the class and says, why do Tibetans eat meat? You know, and Genla has like spoken about this hundreds of times, right? But I mean, it's a valid question. It's a valid question. It's not really a stupid question, because in Buddhism we talk a lot about non-violence, but it's a question which maybe has been addressed many times. And then there are really stupid questions, like stupid questions, stupid. And, you know, Genla's great talent for the stupid question was to take it and somehow make something wonderful out of it that enriched everyone in the class, and then the person who had asked the question thought they had asked a really marvelous question, and he thanked them for asking the question. So that was really beautiful, because that person went away feeling really happy. The whole class had been enriched by what had been said. So you see how this question and answer thing is quite complex. It can be very, very enriching and very worthwhile. So we should always take what the questioner seriously and realize that maybe also hidden underneath the question is something maybe much deeper. Maybe they have lost somebody very dear to them, or, you know, something very important that is maybe lying under the question. Okay, so that's what I want to say about oral translation. Oral translation, you know, was my special thing. I mean, yes, Gamla and I did 11 books together. We did 10 books together while he was alive. 9 were published by Snow Lion, but Snow Lion no longer exists. Those books are with Shambhala now. And then 1 book on Buddha nature was published here at the library. And then after Genla passed away, I compiled his teachings on Lojong Tunduma, the 7 points for training the mind, Geshe Chekawa's wonderful text. It was one of Genla's favorite texts. So I compiled a number of teachings that I had heard, and you know, there were recordings. So I compiled that, and I gave it to the library as a tribute to Genla, because it was one of his favorite texts. When I first knew Genla, he was in a tiny, tiny room. Tiny, you know. You couldn't move in it. You couldn't do you couldn't do a full prostration in that room. You know, there was no room, because there was a bed and a table and, you know, bookshelf. And so anyway, you know, and then I would, you know, come to visit him, and on his pillow I always saw a text that was open, right? And then one day I, you know, plucked up courage and I said, Genla, what's that text? And then he said, Lojong. He didn't tell me which Lojong, but it was obvious to me that it was something very, very important to him, and something that he was reading every day. So that made a deep impression on me. And for me personally, Lojong is what I love best. You know, I'm not a tantric practitioner, but Lojong, if you know what Lojong is, mind training. There are many wonderful mind training texts, but my favorite ones are Lojong Tsikyema, you know, just 8 verses. Each verse is so hard to practice, right? Easy to remember, you know, I know the verses by heart. Easy. Very difficult to put them into practice in one's daily life. And then, you know, that's by Geshe Langri Tangpa Dorji Sengi. He wrote that. And then Geshe Chekawa wrote the 7 points for training the mind, Lojong Tunduma, as a kind of commentary on Lojong Tsikyema. So those are my very, very favorite things. You know, and I love Junjuk. So I don't feel ready to be a tantric practitioner, you know, really. Until I do something to tame this wild mind of mine. So now, written translation. When you're doing written translation, it's very different. You need a whole different kind of energy. You know, you need much quieter energy. For oral translation, it's very lively and, as I said, dynamic. For written translation, you need to be quiet, and you have plenty of time to think, and you have to make a lot of policy decisions, like what terms are you going to use to, of course, one word, it's not that one word has one translation and only one translation. There are many, like a word like chu, you know, can mean so many things, right? It means phenomena. It means the Dharma, you know, the teachings. It means practice, right? It sometimes has meaning, chö, che, gore, right? So you have to practice, you have to put it into practice, nyamlen, you know. So it has many, many different meanings. So you have to understand there isn't one equivalent for each word. And men tend to want to find one equivalent. This is a well-known fact, that when men are learning languages, they want, you know, what does this word mean? And they want one word for one other word. Whereas women tend to be more holistic in their approach to language learning. So this is something which has been established. So we need that flexibility, you know. But when you are doing written translation, you need to make certain policy decisions so that your translation is consistent, right? Consistency is very, very important, you know, to have that consistency and clarity. Clarity should be your main objective. So you need to find a fine balance between being faithful to the original, right? You don't want to distort the original. You want to be faithful to the original, but at the same time, you want to be clear. You want to produce something that reads elegantly. You want to produce something which reads like real English. So of course that's like not so difficult for me, because I was lucky enough to have a good education, so I can write quite nice English. But even for me, I have to edit and edit and edit and edit myself, right? So for you, because English isn't your native language, if you're translating something into English, you must always get a native English speaker to read through your work and edit it. Edit in this case does not mean change the meaning. That's not what the editor should be doing. You're responsible for the meaning, but your editor's job should be to make sure the English is correct and polished, right? It's not your editor's business to change the meaning. So if the editor wants to change the meaning, the editor needs to consult with you. And anyway, any changes should always be run past the translator. So when I was publishing my books, I had an editor in the States. So I had two, because I'm a British English speaker. It wasn't always it didn't always go the way I wanted, because Americans use much more punctuation than I feel comfortable with, and they spell some words differently, right? But I had to go along with that. I was happy to do that because the book was being published in the States. So here in India, I can use British English, so that's fine. You know, I feel comfortable with that. But otherwise, my editor was marvelous. We had the most marvelous 9 books we did together, right? Out of the 11, 9 books we worked on together with the same editor. We never had any disagreements. She was really good about making suggestions, and I always took her suggestions very seriously. And almost everything I agreed to, you know. So we had a very harmonious and lovely relationship. Yeah, I still love her, you know. So if you're, and I write in English, so like I too had an editor. So you even more need someone who is a native English speaker to read through what you do. And before you give it to that person, you have to read and reread and check what you've translated, check again, and don't be satisfied with, you know, doing it once or twice. Every book I've done, I've gone over and over and over again, edited, reread, polished, and cut things out. It's like your job is to cut away everything unnecessary. You don't want a whole lot of unnecessary words, a whole lot of garbage. Cut it away, pare it away. It should be elegant and spare, like thin, not fat, not like an elephant, Cut it away, so that it becomes just the essential. So that's, what you have to aim for. Now, the other thing is, like, if you're working, say you're translating into Tibetan from English, right? Say you're translating a text on ecology into Tibetan. Or I was translating Buddha Dharma into English, right? I was translating the Buddha's teachings into English. You should work with somebody who knows that subject, right? So if you're translating a text on ecology into Tibetan, you need to work with somebody who really understands ecology and English, right? And I needed to work with my Genla. I never have dreamt of translating a Buddhist text into English without Genla. I was totally dependent on him. The first book that we did together was Aryadeva's, thank you, darling, was Aryadeva's 400 verses on the middle way, Umashigyapa. Right, so it was a really big text. There was no other translation. We translated Geshe Dharma Rinchen's commentary on Umashigyapa. So I had to translate the root text, and I could never, ever have done that without Genla. And it took me 15 years to do it. And we went through that text 11 times together. 11 times. We went through every word of that text. Gradually, as we did that, I could understand more and more Tibetan. When I started out, I needed a translator between me and Genla. At the end, everything, and Genla was so patient. There were many things that were very difficult to understand. I had to ask him the same thing over and over again because I couldn't understand. A few weeks later, I'd ask it again. A few weeks later, I'd ask it again. And he was patient, and he went through everything with me. So it took me 15 years to translate that. So, you have to be really, really patient when you're doing that kind of translation, and to work in tandem, with somebody else. To work. Now, when the great Lotsawas came from Tibet to India, you know that how many of them died. So many of them died. They were sent, who was it who sent them? King Chisong Detsen who sent them, right? So they came over the Himalayas. Think of the journey, right? The terrible journey over the Himalayas. Then they came, to Kashmir. And there were all these difficult pundits, who you had to please, otherwise they wouldn't teach you anything. Right, so you had to basically serve them. Indian gurus are not easy, right? Even today, they're not easy, right? So you can imagine what they were like then. And so then they had to, different climate, different food. They had to study hard. Think of what they accomplished, these translators. When I go and look in the Kangyur and in the Tengyur, I'm deeply moved. It really moves me. The tears come into my eyes when you think what they achieved. And you always see the name of the translator and the Indian pundit with whom he worked. Right? There's always a Sanskrit name there and a Tibetan name. And then the people who revised the translation, who went through it later and improved it. And again, you see a Tibetan and Sanskrit name. So they worked together. If they did it, we need to do it too. That's our great example. And they gave their lives for it. And when you see how much they accomplished, how many texts, one translator like Rinchen, LTWA Rinchen Sangpo, there's so many others. When you see what they managed to do, it's like overwhelming. They must have worked so hard, day and night. Of course, they had no television, no cinema, no Facebook, no Twitter, no smartphone, nothing. So they devoted themselves wholly to this project, and they were very much aware that they were taking something extremely precious back to Tibet. So I think we need to approach it with that kind of enthusiasm, as much as we can anyway. Maybe we can't quite do that, but yeah. All right. So, just in conclusion, whether our translation is oral or written, the translator has the responsibility to be accurate, but at the same time to translate with style. Right? We should always remember that we are disseminating knowledge. We're passing on knowledge to other people. Right? So that, that's a big responsibility when you're passing on knowledge to other people. You have to make sure that you don't mislead them. So that makes a casual or lazy approach completely inappropriate. We should approach our work with precision, with enthusiasm, and with an open mind, always willing to learn from other people. You sometimes see translators who bristle when anybody suggests a different way of translating something. You can see the bristles coming out, rising, the porcupine spines. It shouldn't be like that. We should welcome it. We should be grateful to other people who are, willing to make a suggestion. Then we can consider whether it's a good suggestion or not a good suggestion, and we can discard. The great Aryadeva Pakpala, who wrote the 400 Shikyapa, he says we should adopt eloquent explanations wherever we find them, right? So we shouldn't be like this, like a horse with blinkers on. We shouldn't be narrow-minded. Our mind should be open. Other traditions, other religions, whatever is enriching, whatever can enrich us. We mustn't lose our own position, but we must be open and willing to receive. So approach your work with a really open mind and with a willingness to learn. And gratitude. We should be grateful. Like I always felt it was a great honor to be in the position of translator, because you were in a position of trust, and you were allowed to be a bridge for other people, and that's an honor. People are trusting you. They're giving you that responsibility. So one should feel what one is doing is precious, and then it'll be fulfilling. Okay, that's all I have to say.